Hello, my name is Kennedy Moore with the Center for Presidential History here at SMU. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Monica Kim. Dr. Monica Kim is a 2022 MacArthur Fellow and a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison with an emphasis in diplomatic and international history. Dr. Kim will be joining us on campus on March 27th from 6 to 7:30 in McCord Auditorium to discuss her new book, The Interrogation Rooms of the Korean War, The Untold History. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for being here with me today.
Well, thank you, Kennedy. It's an honor to be speaking with you, and I'm very excited about my upcoming campus visit and talk.
As are we. So, just like a little question to get us into it. I've been curious about what made you choose not only the Korean War, but the prisoners of the Korean War to focus your research on.
Oh, it's a great question. So, in terms of why the Korean War, well, there's kind of two ways to answer that. One is that as a Korean American growing up in New Jersey, there was a war that entirely affected the reasons why my parents decided to emigrate to the United States. That was just entirely absent from any history book in any of my classrooms. So when I went to graduate school, I did know that I wanted to do a history of the war that was much more bottom up than top down. There are quite a few histories of the Korean War that are very much about kind of those elite historical actors like presidents and generals. And I just was much more interested in ordinary people, right? And in terms of why the prisoners of war, well, the issue about the prisoners of war really kind of captured, it was kind of like a prism of all of the upheaval that was happening at that time in terms of who could call what a war, right? What did it mean to even have laws of war? And also, especially in terms of the US's history in front of the two Koreas. So, in terms of the prisoners of war, the the armistice actually was actually held up for 18 months due to only one thing that was still left on the negotiation table, and that was the issue of prisoners of war and what where they would go and what they would do once the ceasefire was signed. And once I realized that, I said, there's something going on here, right? Why is the US, why is North Korea and China, why is everybody so invested in this? And then just scratching a little bit further, I also realized that our whole idea about brainwashing actually comes out of this particular moment. So I knew that there was a lot there for me to kind of pull together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in your book, I noticed that you use a lot of anecdotal stories. What was the like research process? Like, how did you gain that, especially like as you said that it was like a topic like the Korean War is not typically taught in textbooks. So like, how did you gather that information? It must have been very difficult.
You know, it's one of those kinds of wonderful aspects of doing historical research, which is that you really need to work with communities. And what I mean by that is, actually, I didn't go into the research for this book thinking I was going to write about interrogation rooms. And in fact, what happened was that as I was doing my research and looking at interrogation reports, I was usually much more focused on the kind of the content, of course, of the interrogation reports. And then one day I realized that the name of the interrogator was something like Jimmy Tanaka or George Yamamoto. And I suddenly realized, well, number one, who is Jimmy Tanaka or George Yamamoto? Doesn't quite sound Japanese. It actually kind of sounds Japanese American. And then number two, I just had no idea actually about what languages were actually being spoken in the interrogation room. So I worked with different community history groups and I did multiple, about 12 oral history interviews
Mhm.
with Japanese American former interrogators from the Korean War.
Wow.
And I also worked with different community historians in South Korea and had also interviewed different former prisoners of war. Now, what comes out of doing that kind of work with community was a story and a history I was not even aware of as somebody who had studied Asian American history, which is that during the Korean War, the vast majority of the interrogation work was actually being done by Japanese Americans. And the reason for that was that at that point, because of Asian exclusion laws, there weren't that many Korean Americans within the United States. And then the US military just kind of reasoned, well, Korea had been colonized by the Japanese. So why don't we have Japanese Americans interrogate them in Japanese without really thinking through the ramifications of the fact that the Japanese Americans they would be drafting for these positions had they themselves been behind barbed wire during World War II in the internment camps, and also that the Korean POWs, we're talking about 5 years after the liberation from Japanese colonial rule, they might not necessarily be so eager to speak in Japanese at that point.
Yeah. So you argue in your book that war is a privilege of sovereign states, while colonial conflicts are labeled as insurgencies or rebellions. My first question is, how does this language reflect post-colonial elitism or classism? And additionally, how does that reinforce the denial of personhood and national legitimacy, especially when global superpowers manipulate POWs' allegiances? Yeah.
What a brilliant question, Kennedy. Thank you. So, the when I was researching and writing the book, I realized that there was a kind of historical puzzle I was dealing with, which is that during World War II, you have mass violence, right? And also in the aftermath of this mass violence, literally globally, you had the proliferation of all these laws of war, right? However, the end of World War II did not herald the end of state-sanctioned mass violence, right? In fact, if anything, it is increasing globally. So, well, there's this kind of strange puzzle of, proliferation of laws of war and also all of the state-sanctioned mass violence. And then I realized, after World War II, though, not a single state has ever officially declared war again.
Mm.
Right. So why is that the case? And exactly as your very astute question points out, post 1945, we have the era of anti-colonial movements,
Yeah.
right? And revolutions. And so um, suddenly war to wage official war became the province of only legitimate states can wage legitimate war, right?
Yeah.
So therefore making anti-colonial revolution is simply insurgents, right? Uprisings, things that simply need to be tamped down, right?
Yeah.
And absolutely, that feeds into thinking about how people imagine personhood, right? So rather than thinking about anti-colonial revolutionaries as actually waging a legitimate revolution, if it's simply being dismissed as an insurgency, right? And then you have massive colonial tactics of violence also being exercised in that moment, right? Then they're considered to be more like criminals. Or we can go even further in terms of how that parlance has a longer legacy as terrorists, right?
Yeah.
And that absolutely does dehumanize entire populations and groups, which then also legitimates a kind of violence that certain states would say is outside the purview of the laws of war because it wasn't war in the first place.
I was wondering, do you see that type of rhetoric being used today and like our current geopolitical like standing or like shifting dynamics?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's happening, I would say, within like domestically within states and also globally, geopolitically, in terms of who gets to wage official war. And then also seeing how that plays out in terms of who is held accountable to the laws of war.
Yeah,
So I think we're seeing absolutely all of that coming to a head right now. And I think that in the United States, we see how that is also playing out domestically too, right? The language of war and who gets to wage legitimate violence is happening also within the United States. It's not always happening outside of the United States.
absolutely. So you say, you frame that the US's ability of POWs was to choose their post-war nation as an exercise in free will. To what extent was the process truly about individual choice, and how was it shaped by political manipulation?
Again, great question. So, as I was doing the research, I realized that rather than looking at the free will kind of language and rhetoric of the US government and the US military, it was much more important to understand what supposed choice was being given to these Korean POWs. And what I discovered was that this choice is entirely a false construction. And what I mean by that is to allow, Korean POWs to choose whether north or south or other places, really sidestep the fact that it was the United States who proposed the 38th parallel as the artificial line that divided North and South Korea. And also, the United States military government decided to sanction in 1948 South Korea as a legitimate state and saying that North Korea was not legitimate. So really making the U.S. as such a major author of that national division. And then during the war, for example, once China entered the war, the US military had a practice of rounding up entire villages. So sometimes you would have three generations of a family behind the barbed wire fence. And so you had a great deal of civilians actually who were rounded up because the US military decided they couldn't decide who was a military personnel and who was a civilian. Also, another thing that was happening was that if a South Korean military soldier was taken as a POW by a North Korean military soldier, and then that North Korean troops were then taken as POWs by the US military decided that they couldn't differentiate between who was North Korean and who was
Gosh.
the South Korean military. So they just put everybody in the POW camp, right? So this whole idea of, free choice and free will, the choice itself was a patently false choice. So if you had people who were, for example, supposedly from the South choosing to go north, well, they had family on both sides of that artificial division. So that's really what they're thinking about. They're not necessarily thinking along the lines of Cold War ideology like the US like to say.
That's fascinating. I have never known that ever before, but that's so interesting. You described that the book is telling a history of war over humanity. What do you mean by that? And why is that essential to understanding this period in history, especially for those interested in international history and diplomacy?
Mm. So I focused on this idea about recognition, right? So it's this moment in the 20th century where it's all about, okay, so if we have something like the United Nations, right? And you have a whole family of nation states, who one only can become a legitimate nation state if the rest of the nation states recognizes you as legitimate and sovereign, right? And the same thing is happening at the level of the individual, right? Who gets to be a legitimate person, worthy of life and protection and to have access to rights? Well, who determines even who gets to be that kind of individual, right? So in a lot of ways, the Korean War was a war both over territory, but also about who gets to determine which person is a worthy member,
Yeah.
right? In a kind of larger humanity, let's say. So it's not just about warfare on the battlefields, right? It's very much a warfare that is over people's individual choices and different states saying, "Oh, we are the ones who can help individuals make a legitimate choice."
When I was researching prior to this interview, I saw that the CIA did like a review over your book and claimed that it was like sensationalization. I wanted to know about that. Like, what's like your response to that? Because it kind of feels like it might be coming from a point of just wanting to like cover up their tracks in a way. So, as like a historian and putting so much time and effort, like how does that affect you in the history that you're trying to share?
Yeah, I mean, as a historian, as somebody who has done a great deal of archival research in Geneva, Switzerland, in the United States, in South Korea, and having conducted many, many oral history interviews, the if it seems sensational, it's simply these people's experiences, right?
Yeah.
And indeed, the sheer drama of what is happening and the high stakes of what was happening, there is no denying that. I will also say, for this research, while I was doing dissertation research, I filed many, many Freedom of Information Acts. And one of the ones that did not come through until 9 years later. And what that particular group of archival files were over 1,000 files of US military interrogations of US POWs returning from North Korean and Chinese POW camps about their experiences of interrogation, right? And so, it's again, in terms of the sensationalizing, it was simply about following the archival trail and really being determined about following that trail. So if it seems sensational to that particular reviewer, all I can say is, you have all of my footnotes and archive, and it's just right there.
Yeah. I mean, history is drama. It just depends on which perspective.
Yes. And there's incredibly high stakes, incredibly high stakes. And I think that we can never either underestimate under or underscore enough um, just how how incredibly high stakes all of these choices were for the most ordinary people involved in the war, right? Whether it's
Absolutely.
Korean POWs or US POWs, there was um, one particular POW, Black POW, who came out of Memphis, Tennessee, who decided that he was going to go to China after the war, and his reasoning was that as long as there is McCarthyism and Jim Crow in the United States, he cannot go back. And he also said, I can go to college if I go to China. And that was not going to be a possibility for him in a Jim Crow Memphis, Tennessee, right? So this, again, it may seem very traumatic, but these are people's lives and people's futures, and they were making the best possible choice in terms of how they were themselves understanding how global geopolitics. I mean, it's not something that merely presidents and generals do, right?
Yeah.
Global geopolitics affects each and every one of us, and we all understand that, right? So yeah, somebody like that particular US POW completely understood that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kim, for speaking to me today. For all those listening, please join us on March 27th from 6 to 7:30 in McCord Auditorium to listen from Dr. Kim herself in person. Thank you so much.
Kennedy.